Let me check. Yeah, yeah, I can see it. Okay. Are we audible?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So I'll start. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this panel discussion on writing autoethnography, hosted by the Department of English, St. Joseph's College, Bangalore.
Hello.
Hello.
Uh, Let me start by introducing the panelists here today. Anquina Ananatha is an alumna of St. Joseph's College, Bangalore. She just completed her master's in English and has submitted her autoethnographic research paper as part of the Indian literature course on resisting caste. I'd like to read out a few lines from her paper titled Shoes to Fill, A Journey of Discovery and Acceptance. Years of this internalized mockery led my parents to naming their children after plants, because somehow being called custard apple or having someone say aquafina is better than being mocked for your character based off your name. Somehow, by giving me a name that has no meaning, they gave me the space to create meaning for myself. The entire piece is available at opendosa.in. Um, Please go read the entire piece once we're done with the panel. Our next panelist is Professor Vijeta Kumar. She teaches English at Joseph's and she takes the Indian literature paper Resisting Caste for the MA English program along with Professor Vijay Shanti Murthy. Third panelist and moderator is me, Dipanata. I am a second year MA English student at Joseph's, and in our classes this semester, we have started the conversation about resisting caste and the autoethnographic research approach. Before I continue, I'd like to notify the audience that they can leave their questions in the YouTube chat box, and we'll address them during the Q&A session. So, just to introduce the audience on what we have been talking about in our Indian Lit classes, we began in June by talking about the absence of caste as a lived social reality. Vijeta ma'am talked about caste as being integral to the Indian experience. However, this reality was not reflected in our textbooks. This happens because systems of knowledge is usually in the hands of the upper caste, and they largely dictate what passes off as knowledge. Vijay Shanti ma'am also added to this and talked about how the resisting caste paper attempts to question this system of knowledge making and how this paper looks at lived experience of caste as a narrative, as a system of knowledge in its own right. So autoethnography is the research component of this IL paper. It is from the words autobiography and ethnography. So auto is the personal experience. So we look at the personal experience of caste amidst the larger social framework of how the caste system operates in various local spaces in India. Yeah. So when I started thinking about writing about family history and my identity in relation to caste, the first thing that came to my mind was how we have never cooked beef at home. Even though mutton, chicken, egg, prawn, everything is fine. But whenever I tell my mom that can we cook beef, can you make beef for me once at home, she just says chi. And everyone in my family says chi. How can you say that you want to eat beef? And this chi is in Bengali we say it for disgust. And it was only after I started reading about caste and engaging about caste that I realized that this chi, this disgust, came from came from caste. So my first question is to Anquina. How did you begin to think about writing this research paper? And can you take us through the process of finally writing it?
Okay. So hi everyone. Um, so coming to the process of writing this paper, I think it was one of the most exhaustive processes that I've ever been through because one, it was physically distressing to write it because I couldn't physically take myself to the computer, sit down and write it, and neither could I get myself in the headspace to write this paper. So initially, we'd have these weekly research seminar hours where we'd have to submit like a write up that was our initial discoveries about caste or about caste in our family. And we were encouraged to keep a caste journal. So every day, if we had an encounter with something or whatever your thought process was about caste, we would have to like pin it down and I was just going through that yesterday, and I realized that all of what I went through and all of what I've been writing was everything in with respect to what is the name of my caste. And I don't know I don't know the name of my caste. I don't know the exact name. And for the longest time, till I got to writing this paper, that's what bothered me most. So when I went to Arul sir and I spoke to him and I told him that I couldn't identify the name of my caste, he told me that it doesn't necessarily matter about the name of your caste. What matters is the experiences around it and your sort of you're looking at your parents' history, you're looking at your history, you're looking at your family's history, and the and sort of tracing that through caste, right? You're using the lens of caste to look at your family's history. And so initially, when I went and I spoke to him and I told him that this is what I wanted to do, he told me that okay, go ahead with it. So I began like poking and prodding to see if my parents would tell me something more about caste in our family and things like that. But every time I went and I spoke to them, they would be like, okay, enough. Like after a point, they'd be like, enough talking about this. Like just go do your work. And so it got to a point where they were getting really uncomfortable to talk about it. So I just kind of left them with that thought, and I would slowly bring it up whenever I could. And coming to like the process of writing this paper, so initially we had like a round table set up, like as in like it was like a group discussion set up in college. Like Vijayata ma'am like made us sit around in a circle, and we were all asked to bring write ups about like whatever you thought about, like how your initial write up to this piece was going to be. And I just wrote about the beef incident. If you've read my piece, you'd know that there's this part where I talk about my dad being uncomfortable with me eating beef and things like that. So that was my starting point. And so I read that out in class, and what I realized is that once I finished that class, I realized that there was a lot more than just food that I had to talk about. Um, because I didn't realize that the experiences that I had when I was in school were very similar to at least 3 or 4 people in the same class. And it didn't hit me until I was in that class and listening to one of my classmates read out her piece, talking about how like she would open her tiffin box and her tiffin box would be filled with fish and everyone would be repulsed by it, right? That was something I thought I was probably the only one who went through, and I didn't think that other people would go through the same thing. And maybe that was the point that I realized that there was a lot more that I had to explore when it came to sort of looking at my history through this idea of caste. And so I went up to Arul sir and I told him, I showed him this piece and I told him that this is what I've started with. And I started talking about how whenever I asked my parents what caste we belong to, they'd always say Adi Dravida. And at that point, he looked up at me. He waited for me to finish talking. He looked at me and he said, "You're Dalit." And that was something that took me a long time to process, because if you think about it, it answers a lot of the questions that I had in my head about why certain things were happening to me in certain spaces. But at the same time, it put multiple questions into my head about why is it that I've never explored it more? Why is it that I didn't sort of look at my life in terms of caste? Why was caste something that I never really paid attention to while growing up? And I think when it came to writing this piece, it was more about me going from that position of being someone who was highly anxious of writing this piece to actually getting it out of my system. So I would spend a good like an hour and a half trying to write this paper, but it wouldn't happen every day. And I would go and talk to Vijayata ma'am about it. I would talk to Arul sir about it, and they would just say write. But the actual physicality of writing it never came to me, because I would stare at a blank screen for over 3 hours and not have anything written on it, because I could never get myself to write it. And I think close to the deadline, very close to the deadline, is when I told myself that, okay, you need to do this. Like, just get it out there. It doesn't matter what happens at the end of it. At the end of it, it's out. You just have to let that be and make your peace with it. So I sat at my computer and I still couldn't write. I could not write this. So I told myself that, okay, you know what? If I can't do it on like staring at a screen, I will take a piece of paper and take a pen and start writing it. And Vijayata ma'am would give me cues almost every day to like the starting sentence of what I had to write. And she'd ask me to write at least a page and a half. And I couldn't go home until I actually wrote that page and a half. And that's honestly how I started writing this paper, because this paper has a lot of my personal experiences, which I've pushed to the back of my head, and I've sort of told myself that I don't want to go back to it. So revisiting those memories and revisiting those aspects of my life, looking at it within this perspective of caste, was quite exciting, I suppose. But yeah, that's how I got to writing the paper, and I finally got it out, and that's how it was.
Thank you, Ankuna. So, since you brought up some of the challenges that you faced while writing, I'd like to ask Professor Vijeta. When students, so in this writing process, when students are writing about caste and revisiting personal history, uh, on one level as a teacher and also as someone who is exploring their own identity through writing about caste, how do you engage with these challenges?
Wait, am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. In the first few classes, talking earlier, before I began to talk about caste in classrooms, I've had a bunch of nasty experiences talking about class in other courses, and by that I mean usually 2 years ago when I used to teach and I was unsure of myself, and I used to broach the topic, almost immediately the conversation would be hijacked by anti-reservation students, and it sort of used to get me how I wouldn't be able to understand why every conversation on caste has to first confront reservation and then about and then about caste violences and things like that. So after a while, I just stopped discussing it. But thankfully, I'm really glad that we are doing this paper exclusively for the MA students. And I had to think of a different method now, because there would be resistance of not the kind that I'm used to in my UG classes. This resistance was a lot more nuanced. And by that I mean there's resistance from both students who are Savarna and Avarna and Dalit. And these resistances themselves are very interesting. So my favorite kind of resistance is to engage with the student who thinks talking about caste is unnecessary, and talking about caste is a thing of the past. You are a Dalit and you are here teaching us. Doesn't that mean that we have progressed and there is no caste and things like that? I have fun bursting these myths. because it sort of allows me to be sarcastic and explore other forms of meanness and things like that. That's one kind of challenge. See, but on a more serious note, I'm also invested in the unlearning that happens in these classes, and some of the dominant caste students who uh, are not displaying resistance because they don't want to hear about it, but they can't believe they've been part of the system uh, unknowingly or knowingly, and somehow it's as if it's been kept from them for so long. Not that they would have caused a big revolution if they had known sooner, but at least some part of it they could have decided what to participate in less willingly or more willingly or whatever. So that kind of control, when you give to students and say this is just as much a part of your choice as in how you make your everyday choices based on who you're friends with, who you sit with, what you eat, who you marry, who you get into a romantic relationship, what films you watch. And when they start to notice all of that, that kind of a challenge is also very interesting for me because um I get to access the part of me that I've had to force to be kinder. Okay, this whole journey has been an experience for me in kindness more than anything. I went from anger to helplessness to deciding that I never want to talk about it to deciding that I don't want to be, I don't want to teach anymore and throwing fits occasionally in my own head to a place where I'm much where I can access kindness easily, even though I may not show it that easily. And this sort of helps solve a lot of these problems in the classroom. Uh, a lot of my intimate conversations with these students have where we've both unlearned. Those are also just as valuable. But quite obviously, my the challenges faced by Dalit students in the classroom. Uh, Now that is something that that's that I haven't found a language to talk about. I mean, constantly I sort of, especially when I'm talking about experiences that are hard to talk about, or I'm trying to sort of broach a topic that is not easy to broach. My eyes are constantly looking for these students because I know that I'll find in their faces what I'm trying to get in that. It's not easy. It can be a look, it can be a nod, it can be a sudden shift in the face, it can be anything. And that sort of helps me go a little further. With Anquina's paper, it was as much of a discovery for me as it was for her. Uh, it's not easy to sort of be confronted by something like this in your adulthood and then sort of figure out your childhood when you're in your adulthood. It's like being given a key that you don't know what to do with anymore. And but all at once, it's also a key that you've been waiting to get, and finally you get it, and you don't know what to do with it. So it was like that. And in her writing of it, I discovered why this paper can do more than what we had hoped for when we began these classes. Anquina and lots of other students from that class, I remember, all their journeys were. It began with a kind of helplessness, and then it reached a place where they were embracing it furiously, this identity. And it's always very happy. I'm always very happy to watch students do this, because and I'm just that much more excited to see what they'll do with this knowledge and where they take it. So I've learned much more as a teacher than they have as a student.
Thank you, ma'am. So, so yeah, you were talking about how one of the challenges was the fact that a lot of students thought that caste was a thing of the past. And from my own experience, before joining UG, before joining the EJP course, I also thought that caste was, happened in villages, and in school textbooks we saw the Varna system. We read about the Varna system. We read about Ambedkar only in the constitutional. what he did to the constitution, and reservation from like news stories about how general category people were protesting against reservation. So that was my only engagement, and then I forgot about it very quickly. Then I came to EJP, and in Vijayadam's classes, we started talking about caste, and like she talked about her own experience of caste. She talked about the project of unseeing caste that a lot of Savarna people do. Then we read Gogu Shamla's story. We saw Kakus, we saw India Untouched, and through all of these, my own blindness to caste, like I could see it. So so since you've already talked about this how do you sort of tackle this unrest, this privileged Savarna unrest that comes as a knee-jerk response to caste. How do we like make a more productive attempt at writing this paper about caste, about lived experience of caste, without letting this denial, anger, guilt take up all of the space in our writing? Vijayata ma'am can answer this. Also, Ankuna can answer if you want.
I think I'll let Vijayata ma'am answer and then I'll like add on to it if I feel like it.
Okay. Okay. So I think I've had interesting conversations with students who have come to terms with uh, uh, with an identity that they didn't knew. I mean, sorry, they didn't know had oppressed uh, other identities so much, and they wanted to know what they could do about do what they could do to make it better, or what they can do to be less less participative in this system. Uh, at one level, as a teacher in the classroom, this can get more challenging than anything else, because I have to consciously be aware. I have to be very, very aware that there are students in the classroom who come from different backgrounds, and for every maybe 10 Savarna students, there can be one Dalit student. They may be, and they may be 2, 3 OBC students. And very often, this is a question I ask myself: whom am I talking to when I'm talking about caste in these classrooms? When I begin talking about caste, should I focus only on the Dalit and OBC students, so they know that they have no reason to be afraid of these classes, or they have no reason to feel inferior, or they have no reason to not want to be in these classes? Or should I focus on Savarna students who might be feeling vulnerable at one level, because we are talking about a history of oppression? And this is also not easy for students, Savarna students, to sit and listen to. It makes them vulnerable, and beyond feelings of guilt and hate and anger, I'm aware that there's also a space where they don't know what to do. And I don't see the point to being a teacher if I'm not able to help those students either. So this is something that I usually tell them. I just tell them to read more Dalit writers, and to sort of ask questions, simple questions simple questions of themselves. When was the last time they saw a photo of Ambedkar in an office where he was not accompanied by a photo of Gandhi or a photo of Nehru? Why is it that we sort of encounter his photo almost as if it's like a arm maiden of sorts to Gandhi's photo and then Nehru's photo? How often are we told that? How often do you see annihilation of caste in book houses? How often do you see waiting for a visa, which is Ambedkar's memoir, in a shelf that is called autobiography or memoir? Okay. I don't get to see it very often. It's usually it's very rare for book houses to have a section called caste, and they dump everything there. But how often does it take for people to notice these things? And I just tell them to sort of open their eyes and see a little more, and include, and not be pushed into a corner where they feel afraid to talk about these things, because that's not what I want. I don't want people to shut up simply because they think that uh, they have oppressed. Okay, then that conversation is not possible. I'm conscious that in situations like these, it's also easy for Dalit and Bahujan students to feel cornered. Okay, and I should be prepared for both kinds of responses. There may be Dalit students who want to talk more about this. There may be Dalit students who don't want to talk about this at all. And my response to both is to leave them alone for a while. This is something that I've had to learn the hard way. I can't sort of be overbearing and say, I'm your Dalit mother, I will love you, I will help you through this, and sort of strangle them with love and affection. Um, it's important to recognize them as thinking individuals more than feeling individuals, and that they know where to find me if they need me. But beyond that, that discovery is something that they have to do on their own, in much the same way that the Savarna student has to do on her own. So, more than anything, I'm excited that about people discovering these things on their own, and that's what makes a paper like this all the more complicated. It's not. I can't quote Ambedkar like I can't even quote Shakespeare. So there are very few lines of Ambedkar's that I know by heart. I can't do it verbatim like that. I can't do this paper without talking about my emotional involvement with this paper, and that's what makes teaching it that much more complicated. I'll answer this in a little more detail, but I think Anquina has some interesting observations about uh, how Savarna guilt in this atmosphere plays out, and what you can do, or what anyone can do, or they can do themselves to sort of get over it.
Yeah, so I think this idea of Savarna guilt is actually quite interesting because so the reason why I think Savarna guilt actually exists is because of this process of invisibilization of caste that has taken place, rather than what Ambedkar or what Periyar would talk about of uprooting caste or annihilating caste, right? So when you invisibilize it and you sort of push it into the normal of your everyday life, you sort of don't realize that the some of the things that you do are actually casteist in nature, and that's it takes you a while to realize that some things are casteist and some things may not be, right? So if you want to say that something isn't casteist, like you should always, like I feel like you should always show me proof that this isn't casteist. But until it isn't shown that this isn't something that is casteist, there will be something or the other that leads up to it, simply because of our country's history with caste, right? It's embedded so deeply within so many of us that we don't realize that many of the things that we do might just be casteist in nature. Like, say, for instance, you sort of, so there's the Savarna guilt on the one hand, okay, but there's also this acceptance of some sorts that the Avarnas face, which I'd sort of like to give you an example to make this a little clearer. So think of this, okay? You're in your house, and say a house help comes home, right? Now you tell the house help, right? You can sit on the sofa. It's fine. We'll give you like our fancy ceramic cupware and things like that. But what do? They say no, right? They say no. They say, get me the mat so that I can sit down, right? So at some level, there's also this Savarna guilt, but there's also this acceptance from the other side that this is where they feel like they belong, right? So that process of sort of getting out of that kind of thinking has, like, it's been an eye-opening process, because at some point you realize that you've also done many things that might have been casteist in nature when you were growing up without realizing it, right? But you sort of use those experiences to explore why. right? Um, if you look at giving different kinds of glasses to the different guests that come home, why do you think people do that, right? So the moment you arrive at a particular problem, you sort of you instead of going into like the narrowing down process, you sort of widen out those questions and look at the broader perspective. Like the house help example, for instance, you look at it in terms of, okay, so why do you think this happens, right? So if it happens in a particular way, why is that particular way accepted as normal? Why isn't that normal questioned, right? Why do we not go beyond that normal? Why do most people not go beyond that normal, right? So you sort of broaden out your questioning sort of zone, and you look at it in terms of the broader perspective to understand how caste can actually play a huge role. Because people think that, okay, this is not a casteist experience, this is not something that is casteist, but if you look at it, it could be. You can't dismiss something without actually like having proof for it. So I feel like the Savarna guilt is also accompanied by this acceptance in some form. And unlearning this process and sort of, getting out of it is essentially what Vijayata ma'am spoke about being kind to yourself, right? That's something that you need to learn, whether you're a Varna or Savarna. You need to learn that irrespective of what has happened, right? These experiences are your own, and you need to sort of look at it and learn that it's okay to have made those mistakes in the past. It's okay for you to have said those things. It's okay that these things have happened to you, but there's this thing of you getting out of that place and sort of learning to accept that this is something that has happened, but you need to go beyond it, right? It's not something that you need to be stuck with. That, okay, I have done these things in life and I'm going to feel extremely guilty about it, right? That's not necessarily the mindset that's good for you. Rather, it's more about, okay, these things have happened and I need to learn how to not do these things, maybe, or I need to learn what I need to do to change these things. Maybe if I want to see change, this is what I would have to do to change it, right? So that's the kind of outlook that I just wanted to like say. That's it.
This sort of reminds me of a parallel that I was thinking about. I was curious about how, in a large section of Savarna liberal, uh, whether it's in the media or in the classroom or in our own families and homes, how very receptive they are towards feminism and towards Marxism, and towards liberal ideas about independence and freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and how when it comes to caste, they have very little to say or they have nothing to say, or they think those issues should be reserved for specific forums. So I've had conversations where it began with where the other person has said things like, I am a Savarna woman, and I have never ever consciously been casteist to anyone. I have never looked down upon a Dalit woman. I have never harmed them and things like that. And my natural impulse was to think about how it's just how it's just like a man saying, I am a man and I've never raped a woman, almost as if the impulse of all men is to rape, and almost as if the impulse of all Savarna women or all Savarna men is to look down upon those who are not Savarna. But can this conversation go elsewhere is the question. So I think the guilt needs to address its own root, the guilt needs to address its own origin, and then figure out why it's happening.
Thank you, ma'am, and Ankana for responding to that. So, since we're talking about a self, right, that is, you have to sort of go back into your own history and find um, how caste has operated in your own family, and how it has influenced your own identity, and this autoethnography piece paper allows us to do that. So Vijay Shanti ma'am, I remember she said in one of her classes how identities are like layers of an onion, and you know, the more you peel, the more identities you reveal. And Arul sir also talked about how every individual identity comes from certain memberships we have with different worlds, with caste, with our family, with language, etc. So, how do you think this research method, autoethnography, will allow students to look at their the self, differently? And if this research practice is the necessary practice among the other more traditional research approaches to talk about caste. Sorry, Anquina can answer that, and then Vijeta ma'am can also add on to it.
All right. So, when you look at the self, and you spoke about how the self is like an onion, right? You, as an identity, have various layers that make up that identity, right? So, the way that I approached writing this paper was looking at me in different aspects of myself, right? Who am I as a daughter? Who am I as a family member? Who am I as a student? Who am I as a friend? Right? So these are aspects of the self that you sort of explore, and then you sort of widen it out. You sort of look at family, you look at culture, you look at the aspect of the social, you look at things like relationships that you share with your family members and with your friends, right? So things like that sort of helps you look at the way in which you write this paper. And honestly, when I began writing this paper, I didn't know what to put in because I had way too much. And I addressed this to both Vijayata ma'am and Arul sir, and they said that you needn't necessarily have to pour out everything that you have into this one paper, that you need to sort of not cherry pick, so to say, but talk about the things that you find easy to talk about, right? It's coming to, so there are things that I've probably experienced that I am not ready to talk about just yet, right? And I didn't want to push myself physically to write that out because Vijayata ma'am was telling me this, that as much as you tell your mind that you know these experiences have happened, your physical self has also experienced this, right? So it takes both the coordination of your mind and your body to get that experience out of you. So if it's not happening, you don't need to force it. So you tell yourself when you're ready to write it, and that's when you write the things that you're ready to write about, right? So when it came to sort of looking at the experiences that I chose and things like that, it sort of helped me discover myself differently, in the sense that what I did was go back to those experiences and place myself outside of the situation to see what that situation was essentially, right? Because as much as you are the participant in your paper, you sort of have to be that little bit of that critical self has to come in and sort of look at that situation in a perspective that you wouldn't normally look at it, right? So take for instance the instance that I spoke about in my paper about the mutton curry, right? For me, for the longest time, I didn't realize that the phrase dead animal and the phrase you killed an animal to eat it were two different things, right? So for me, it felt like at some point, because we were so young, it probably would have been something to do with maybe the lack of the word, or because they were used to hearing that one word ever, like if you see meat around, right? So something like that sort of made me think about what could be the possible way in which, why would that person have to say it, right? For me to identify that as something that is related to caste, right? That isn't something that just, oh, I'm making fun of you, right? It's something that is about caste, because when you say dead animal, it is a reference to caste, and it isn't something that is not, right? So when I looked at that, it was more about me placing myself outside of that situation and looking at it in a way that sort of, um, if I put it in the sense that I was sort of being like the third person the narrator in that situation, to sort of see how it played out, right? And so things like that, when I wrote that particular part of my piece, I didn't really want to go back to it, because there are certain things that I wouldn't necessarily like go back to, and this was one of them, because these are things that leave an impression on you, right? They sort of stay with you even now when you open a tiffin box, right? These are some things that are, they sort of define who you can be even now. And when I look at how I've explored myself, right, self in quotes, myself through this piece, I've realized that I've gone from being a person who identifies with me as my name as my marker, to a person who's looking at how caste has played a role in defining the person, or defining the identity that I have sort of made for myself. So that's, I hope that sort of cleared some of the things that you were asking about. So
Thank you, Anquina. Do we have time for another question, or should we open it up to the Q&A?
The autoethnography bit.
Yeah.
Anquina said something very interesting. I'd like to sort of take that up and respond to why we are talking about autoethnography in this panel and how it's important to Dalit discourse and Dalit literature and Dalit research, and talking about caste and resisting caste, as we call it. So Ankuna used the word pouring out when she was talking about the beginning of her research paper. So for those of you who've just joined, this is just to tell you that we teach a paper called Resisting Caste, and both Dipanita and Ankuna have been students of this course. And they are supposed to turn in a research paper that uses autoethnography as a research approach to figure out personal history and its relationship to caste. So she used the word pouring out when she was talking about her relationship and her difficulty in writing this paper. I'm fascinated that she used this word, because this is the exact dilemma that most Dalit students have. How do I structure this? Okay, so first of all, it takes me forever to convince them that their fractured relationship with this research paper, as we call it, is just as important as someone else's very neat and logical relationship with language. Okay, to begin with, the idea of research itself as it's practiced. Okay, I blame Savarna academicians for the kind of quandary we are in right now with academics. And by that, I mean, why are students finding it so difficult to write research papers? I am 32 years old and I still find it difficult to write research papers. And I was bred in a Savarna education system that didn't help me with research at all. Today, research is stuck in social sciences in this very weird phase where, for us, academic writing has come to mean, when do I use the word explained? When do I use the word explored? When do I use the word this has opined to mean? This raises questions. I'm choosing to explore. I'm seeking. That is Savarna language and that is Savarna discourse. And it's the most boring kind of discourse. If people, after having hijacked knowledge systems for so long, they haven't produced one good thing about research, and this is both disappointing and amusing. I can't take Savarna academicians seriously at all, because not one of them have produced someone like Fran Lebowitz, who has fun with research, who has fun with literature, and who makes people laugh. Okay. Now, people always turn around and ask Dalit scholars and intellectuals, why has it taken you so? Why have you people produced only one Ambedkar? Where is the empowerment? Why can't you produce one Ambedkar in every classrooms? I'd like to ask them the same question. Has any one of you, Savarna academicians, produced one person who can make us laugh and inform us and entertain us at the same time? No. What have you done with the knowledge system that you've acquired for so long? You've sort of left it rotting. It's because of them we are suffering with these words like exploring, divining, opining, proposing, seeking. And that's why autoethnography is such a huge relief for me, because I am done with these words. I don't have to sit and die with these words. But the challenge is this: I have to convince students that that is not the only way to do research by using fancy big scientific words and showing that you're capable of distance from your subject. No, that's bullshit. There are fascinating ways of doing research. And this has been the biggest discovery for me, which is to look inside and see what you are most curious about and using that as research. Isn't that the basis of research, by the way? Why has social sciences just succumbed to lab experiments like this, in the way that biology experiments are run, in the way that science classes happen, in the way... What is the difference at this point between sciences and social sciences? Everyone just wants to be a science. And this is ridiculous. So autoethnography at this point is, I'm proud to say, has been something that the Dalit community and the Bahujan community have been doing consciously or unconsciously for a long time. To begin with oral histories and how they passed on things like what to do. A question that Professor Arulmani told me to sort of ask myself whenever I have a question about how do I figure out, how do I have a conversation about caste with someone, is ask them how they bury their dead. Okay, ask them how they cook rice. Simple things like that will reveal caste. And why is it that in our academia today there is no room for questions like that? Okay, why is the question how do we bury our dead? Why does it have to be understood only scientifically? And why must we be so afraid of beginning a research paper with the words I think or I feel? Okay, why are we so afraid of the word I? Do we think that no one is going to take it seriously if we begin it with I? That's again a fear and a discourse that is a result directly of the Savarna acquisition of academics. Okay, and what do I mean by Dalit community's relationship with autoethnography is a lot deeper than that. I'm going to quote Siddlingaya, who in his book Uru Keri, translated by S.R. Ramakrishna, called A Word with You World, at the end, D.R. Nagaraj, writer and cultural critic, has a small essay on Siddlingaya's book. And he has something very interesting to say. He says, when we read Dalit autobiographies in Kannada and Marathi, we get the feeling that we are looking at bonsai trees. They compress several novels into a small autobiography. Now, let's go back to what Ankwina said about pouring out. Now, there are several reasons why this happens. You don't want to sort of keep figuring out why this is affecting you so much. So, Ankwina's difficulty with writing a research paper is the result of this kind of dilemma, this kind of helplessness, this kind of feeling claustrophobic and not knowing what to do with this identity. Go back to that key thing that I told you about, being given a key after having waited for it so long and now you don't know what to do with it. So it sort of creates a kind of fracture between the Dalit student and her research. She doesn't know how to write this paper. The only way to rescue that is by producing it and in small outbursts. Okay, so from Uru Keri to Gogu Shamala to Bama, I'm fascinated by how they write these stories in what D.R. Nagaraj calls bonsai trees. If you've seen a bonsai tree, you would know how cutely and how nicely they grow in one small thing, but it just grows like that, and it doesn't need a lot of space. That is the point of it. That's what D.R. Nagaraj meant when he said reading Dalit autobiographies is like seeing a variety of bonsai trees. Okay, what is called in the English language vignettes is a sort of a release for our stories and our forms to sort of have space, whatever little is available, and grow there. And that I find fascinating. D.R. Nagaraj also said that Siddlingaya's voice is one of the very rare voices in our community, because he said Siddlingaya's voice is the special voice of a creative writer. Okay, in Uru Keri, he is writing both as a poet and an activist. Okay, and I love that we have someone like Siddlingaya to learn from. And I think he's sort of, people like him have left a lot of space for us to breathe life into a dead Savarna space and to reclaim it and make it look more livable and lovable, and maybe reach a position and a point where we don't have to be stuck with dead language and dead logic with words like explore and implore and all of that, and freely use words like I think, I believe, I feel, and not in a dead end way, but this happened. So Anquina had one fascinating story about some beef sausages that her
No.
aunt used to hide, which I found fascinating. And I told her she must put it in a research paper. And if you read Uru Kerry Sidlingaya, you will see that he's taken anger and made it sarcasm. And all of this is possible in a mode that is autoethnography. Okay, so Uru Kerry is a good example of an autoethnography. Okay, I hope that answers your question. I, if you have, I mean, I think if the audience, I mean, if the people have any questions to ask at this point.
Hmm. Yeah, and also something that you said, ma'am, just now about the Savarna labels and these strict categories that you tend to put. So you in a Viva, you told me about this also when I was talking about Gogo Shamla's paper, and you said how these categories, is it non-fiction, is it autobiography, and you have this genreifying where but something like this at the time I didn't know about autoethnography, but yeah, now that you're talking about this, I feel like, yeah, that is also autoethnography.
Just one last thing. Sidlingaya says something fascinating about, sorry, D.R. Nagaraj says something fascinating about Sidlingaya's bit. He says, the Dalit literary sensibility has yet to accept that the elements of the autobiography are themselves the material of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love how at one level we don't have access to these forms and platforms, but at another level, because we didn't grow up in dead languages and dead logic or whatever and dead ends, we have the kind of beauty to sort of seek new forms and sort of merge two forms and not be stuck, as you pointed out, in
Yeah.
categories of fiction and autobiography and things like that.
Okay. So we'll open up the Q&A session now. Um, we have received about 2 questions. Yeah. So if more people, if you want, you can leave your questions in the chat box. The first question is from Geeta Jayakumar. She's asking, does caste become a delimiting factor to our personality?
Okay. Okay, I'll take that up, and then maybe Anquina, if you can respond
Yeah.
to that. Uh, it's a limitation to everybody, and not just in terms of personality, but in terms of everyday decisions and everyday choices that we make. I can't. I mean, students often ask me, "You talk so much about caste. What is the end to this? When can we stop talking about this?" I said, you tell me Ambedkar wrote an entire paper on annihilation of caste, and yet our social science textbooks are hellbent on calling it eradicating caste. Look at the world of difference between these two words. One is annihilation and one is eradication. And we are still stuck at a time and at a place where we are refusing to look at it. It took one Cisco incident abroad for people to sort of, for the liberals and the Hindu liberals living abroad to sort of wake up to the fact that caste is still alive in the Indian society. Ambedkar predicted this ages ago. He said that caste is an Indian problem for now. The moment the Hindu person enters the West, it will become a global problem. And it is a global problem. Long before the Cisco incident happened, it was always a global problem. So it is. I hope you could have restructured the question, the phrase a little bit. But from what I can understand, yes, it limits everything that we do. And I think the only way out of it as of now is to talk more about it in so much that lead will start falling out of people's ears because they're tired of listening to it so much. Anquina?
The one interesting thing that I just wanted to note, and something that's been hyped up right now, is this beautiful Netflix series called Indian Matchmaking, which sort of looks at this element that you were talking about, how caste needn't necessarily just be in India. It can also be something that you look at abroad as well, because there are communities abroad that do practice this thing, right? And that's something that really, like when you watch that show, it sort of opens your eyes out to a lot of things that take place in our country, as well as some of that is carried over to countries that are in the West, right? So this brings me back to this idea of Ambedkar's escape from caste, and how when he went to the West, he felt like he was free of caste. But then the moment he entered the country again, he could not run away from it, right? It always, he felt like he was running in a circular path. For me, it feels like at some point, when you start accepting the fact that okay, these experiences are about caste, and you're going to talk about caste, and to see how limiting it is, or to sort of address caste itself, is sort of you not running away from it, but rather running a marathon to see when you will sort of get tired of talking about this thing, and how it's just going to, it eventually will have an end to it. I'm pretty sure it will. But it's supposed to be like this constant effort to engage in conversations about it, to sort of um, not normalize caste, but sort of normalize conversations about caste. Because you feel like, okay, these are some things that I don't necessarily want to talk about, because, oh, it's in the past. We don't do these things anymore, and it's not caste anymore, or we're not casteist anymore, right? The more you sort of engage with it, the more you question why, the more you sort of place yourself in a position where you tell yourself that you're going to ask yourself these questions about why, right? The why is important in when you look at the question that the person has asked, which is it limiting your, like, yourself, right? What is it that limits you? So why is it that caste is something that limits yourself, right? So opening out conversations about that would sort of help us to like maybe get rid of it in the long run. So that's, if that helps.
Thank you, Ankuna and Ruchita ma'am. This question is by Akash Sharma. He's talking about how the research space has been dominated by the privileged Savarna perspective. Even auto ethnographies have been and memoirs have been dominated by that. But how do you make academic writing and research papers more accessible so that it reaches and empowers people who are Dalit people, Bahujan people who are trying to narrate their experiences?
Arulsa told me about Shodh Ganga, which has a lot of material, research material. It's been a good experiment. He often sends me papers, and this is again another hoax of Savarna academics. So there'll be an entire publication on something like the Dalit experience in music or something, and all the publishers will be Savarna. How is it the Dalit experience in music if all the publishers and even the editors are Savarna, is the first question. And I know many Savarna academicians who, again, two kinds. I'm not saying that if you are a Savarna, you only talk about your thing. This is not a turf war. Anybody is free to learn. Everybody should be willing, be willing to sort of learn about other people. But when it comes to writing, to sort of pay attention to, are you really curious about this? Or are you doing this because no one else has done this and you think you can win? Again, you can win good academic scores if you sort of lay a paper and win about 25 points for having published something that no one else before has published. Okay, and look at the surge of Savarna academicians within the field of Dalit discourse and Dalit studies. Why? Because it's because the knowledge system is designed in such a way that lived experience is not considered knowledge. Okay, so when and who are the people to benefit from this? When lived experience is not considered as knowledge, the only people to sort of produce their own knowledge systems, even with something like Dalit studies, will be Savarna academicians. Okay, so and I that's something that's happened repeatedly, but I've sort of also has been able to access some material on Shodh Ganga where experience and knowledge have sort of merged and sort of given rise to interesting research topics. And now a lot of Dalit academicians are sort of exploring their own narratives and folk tales and in terms of food and in terms of poetry, and this has been accepted. So, but see, within the space of academia itself, what can we do to make writing more accessible? Before that, I think we need to ask the question, what can we do to get more people to write? Okay, we can't talk about accessibility without talking about production. Who is writing? Okay, and who is reading these things is the first question. When we decide these questions, maybe accessibility is an answer that can come naturally. The Rohit Vemula archive that is on OpenDosa right now is free for anyone to read with internet access again. But again, I am interested in seeing more writing and production more than before we tackle questions on accessibility.
Thank you, ma'am. The next question is by Seher Zareen. How do you tackle intersectionality in autoethnographies while managing the volume of content, if that could be an issue in a research paper?
I'll just have 2 sentences to say to that, and maybe Ankuna should take over. I think intersectionality is the biggest lie of the 21st century. There is no such thing as intersectionality, because so far all these intersectional experiences have just been stories of hijack. Intersectional feminism is like doing major rounds everywhere within academia. And maybe it's a little unfair to say that it's the biggest lie of the 21st century, but I just want to say it anyway, so that we can get it over with. And this I'm saying because when the biggest movement happened in 2018, when Me Too happened in India, when the Indian Me Too movement happened, intersectionality was just casually forgotten. I don't know many Dalit women who came out and said Me Too. I don't, even though Raya Sarkar started the Losha list, within the discourse of Indian feminism, when it began, she was conveniently forgotten to begin with. Intersectionality is always an afterthought, in my opinion, and it's a PS. Okay, it's something that people remember more than something that they want to begin anything with. It's like suddenly saying, "Oh, today we have a panel on Dalit writers of 21st century, but we need at the last minute, let us find one Dalit person so that it won't look bad." That is intersectionality today.
Okay, so to sort of take over from that, there's this one really interesting autoethnography piece that I read called From Here to There, which I have sort of quoted in my paper. So that sort of looks at race and feminism all together and sort of looks at the idea of race and gender together when you talk about spaces and to talk about this idea of identity, right? So obviously there are, like we've spoken about the onion peeling section, there's always going to be multiple things that constitute who this person is, right? So it's I'm not sure if there's an intersectionality of sorts, or I feel like it's more of a what comes along with it, more like both of them are going hand to hand, that there are these things that you talk about that go together, right? So if I can take the example of the person who wrote that paper, From Here to There, she speaks of this one class of us. So she's a lecturer and she goes to a class and she starts talking about race, and people don't take her seriously because she's a black woman, she's talking about race, and she's also a woman, right? So I'm not too sure about the whole idea of intersectionality. I'm a little confused about it, but I feel like instead of it going like crossover, as in like they're crossing paths, I feel like when they're dealing with a problem, it's more of like a hand in hand situation where you're addressing one issue along with another issue. That's it.
Thank you, Ankwina, ma'am. So Seher, Dareen also added to that what you were talking about, the Me Too movement. She said that the Me Too tag was started by Black women in the US, but they were they were left out of this conversation. Only the white and upper class women became sort of the spearheaders. Another question is by Rahul Gabriel Roy. It's about caste and racism. He's saying that they both have various similarities. So, would it be right to say they both function similarly? Is the difference limited to the context it is set in, which is the Indian and the West?
Okay. Uh, uh, I'll take this up quickly, and Ankwina, I'll give it up to you. At one level, they are very similar, and at one level, they're really not. Okay. I mean, race and caste. They are as similar as they're dissimilar, and they're more dissimilar than they're similar. And here's why. And this is an anecdote that sort of made it very clear to me why caste and race are so different from one another. This is the story of Ambedkar, which Ankwina mentioned, when he left to Colombia. And he says that in Colombia, when he was doing his research and when he was studying, caste was in the back of his mind, but not something that he was consciously thinking about every day. Because constantly in the middle of white people and talking and studying and researching, it was easy. It was easier to forget that he was Dalit. Where in Colombia, the moment he came back to work for the Maharaja of Baroda, and he came back and then he landed in the railway station. And the moment he hits the platform, he was once again aware of caste. That's how caste functions. Okay, so and to make that a little more complicated, I was in Seattle last year for a scholarship, and it and in the first few weeks I was very high on the kind of energy that there is in sort of being free from caste for a little while at least, because it was not something I had to consciously talk about. I only consciously had to introduce it or explain it to the people who were asking me about it. Okay. But then I saw that if you recognize something like caste, and if you've been a part of it, and you've been at the other end of receiving oppression, and when you go elsewhere, it sort of makes it that much more easier for you to recognize other forms of exclusion. Okay, so I was sort of noticing how the only Black student in our group, the only Black colleague in our group, was feeling left out. Okay, and that is again something that was the opposite of what happened to Ambedkar, and maybe even me. Okay, and to sort of make that also more complicated, Chimamanda Adichie's Americana is a story of a Nigerian woman who goes to America, and she says she felt very aware of being Black when she landed in America. It's the exact opposite of what happened to Ambedkar, and this is how caste and race are very dissimilar. Okay, and when she returned to Nigeria, she didn't have to realize her Blackness at all. She didn't have to be aware of it, because all around her there were people. You're not a Black if you're in Nigeria, is what she said in the book. Okay, but you become a Black when you enter a white country. And this is another American poet, Claudia Rankine, who said that I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a white background. Okay, so as systems of oppression, as power structures, they're similar in the way they expect subservience, and they expect a certain community of people to be a certain way because they were born that way. Okay, but as the way people experience it and the way people escape it and are not able to escape it, they're completely different. Okay, now that people are waking up to the fact that caste is actually a global problem, okay, now it's all the more visible that caste and race are not the same thing.
Yeah. I completely agree with Vijayata ma'am. Another just one point to sort of add on to the similarity between caste and race is that they both function in the realm of the social, right? That caste is what they say is like a social form of discrimination, right? If you go by sociology textbooks that look at the definition of caste, right? And if you look at race as well, it is in the realm of the social, right? So if you look at trying to draw similarities between race and caste, you can sort of just look at it in terms of this. And I don't necessarily have anything to add because Vijayatram just like said everything. So that's just what I wanted to add to.
Thank you. So those are the questions that we've received till now. Cherian sir had a
If there are no
response.
questions, Anquina, if Anquina would like to sort of offer some remarks about what it's like after having written this paper and having come to terms with your identity. Now, what do you see ahead?
Okay. I'll just wait for to see if there are more questions and then I'll answer that.
Wait,
We
we have
got
a
one
question.
question.
Sorry, say that again.
We just got a question.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, the message has been retracted. They deleted it. Okay, Anquina, go on with your response.
Okay, so my remarks about what it's been like after writing the piece and how I've come to terms with accepting it. It's been rather interesting because I began. So I started questioning a lot of the experiences that I've had, and a lot of the things that we do as a family, a lot of the things that my friends say, a lot of the things that I've experienced, right? It sort of helped me look at it differently and to sort of understand that a lot of these things happen and you need to acknowledge that these things happen. The process of getting it out there was very nerve-wracking, yes. I did quite feel myself being very nervous for a piece like this to be out on the internet for people to access and read, because these are parts of yourself that you wouldn't necessarily put out there, right? These are experiences that you are sort of vulnerable to, and the thing that sort of kept me going, and the one thing that both Arul sir and Vijayata ma'am said, was that somewhere somebody is going to read that and feel like they're not alone, right? Somebody is going to read that and feel like what I felt when my classmate read out that experience of the smelling fish from the tiffin box, right? To sort of have that sense of not being alone, of having this experience that okay, that these experiences that you've had are not necessarily things that are something that you need to beat yourself up about, right? These are experiences that are very, very similar to other people, and other people have had very, very similar experiences, and it's all about this idea of sharing. I think the more I sort of put this piece out there, a lot of people reached out to me and spoke about how they've never realized that certain things that they've said or that they've done were actually casteist in nature, and that this piece actually opened out their eyes to things like this. And I think the point of writing this piece is essentially, one is to come to terms with the fact that this is who you are, right? To sort of come to terms with this is your identity, and the what follows that is to sort of look further. So the way I've been looking further is exploring the idea of Dalit writing and looking at how these experiences that people have had are so different, and so are things that people hardly speak about, are things that people hardly have access to, like Vijayata ma'am said. And the more you sort of pry and look at these experiences, you realize that these, what you might have felt growing up, or what you might have experienced growing up isn't something that you've done alone, or isn't something that you need to beat yourself up about. That there are people who are very similar to you, or that there are people who've had very similar experiences out there. Like, that sort of tells you that these experiences that you've had are not something that you've been through alone, but also something that opens it out for other people to know that they aren't alone. Right? It's sort of like an extending hand, that you're saying that, listen, it's okay that you feel this way, but at the end of the day, that there are people who've been through the same things or similar things that you have, and that you might feel uncertain about these things, but that uncertainty is like a feeling that's felt by a lot of people, and that you don't necessarily feel that alone. So that's something that came through my writing, and that's what I felt. So got it.
Thank you, Ankana. Um, so we have one question that was already addressed, I think. So Margaret Preeti is asking, by simply looking into our identity, are we not adding to the ladder in the name of annihilation? So
Can I
if you
answer
would
that?
like,
Can I please answer that?
Yeah,
Can I
yeah,
please?
yeah. Good.
See, first of all, wait, let me answer. The question is, if caste is something that was created and propagated by people, is it still necessary to attribute ourselves to something that was created like this? I think this is a question we should ask the upper caste Indians of our society. Is it still necessary to specify in the matrimonial section that fair brides wanted, or a person from only this caste is applicable to marry to me? I want this person who looks like this from this caste. Why is it important for people to marry into castes if this is not important anymore? Is it specifically, I mean, is it very necessary for restaurants to say we don't serve beef here? Is it necessary for people to say that, oh, please don't make this also about caste, when actually it was just when it was just a casual question? I think when we can answer those questions, then we can answer this question. That's the first thing. And the second question is, by simply looking into our identity, are we not adding to the ladder in the name of annihilation? Uh, Annihilation doesn't happen by ignoring something. This is like the simple metaphor of a cat drinking milk with its eyes closed and convinced that no one is looking at it. Caste is not going to go away if we stop talking about it. It's going to get worse. It is this worse, even though people have not talked about it that much. And this is a simple discussion between two harmless Dalits who are talking about research papers, and already people are wondering if it's necessary to talk about our identity. Can you imagine what will happen if we take sticks and walk out on the streets and start a revolution? We're not even doing that. There are I'm actually not all that interested in revolution. What I want is the freedom to make choices, and the freedom for my students to make choices about how they want to live, what they want to eat, how they want to write, whom they want to love. And as long as caste exists that much in India, these kinds of freedoms are not possible. That's the thing. This ties up to what Dipanita raised earlier about what do you do with the Savarna guilt. Okay, and this is something that Fran Lebowitz, the Jewish woman from America, addressed about race. She's a white woman, and she's very aware of her privilege in a way that doesn't make her a savior of sorts. She's not interested in saving anyone. She's very clear. And she knows that she has very little to say about race in that way. But this is what she says. She says that people who are interested in anti-caste discourse, I mean, she talks about race, but I'm going to use that for anti-caste discourses. She says people are interested in annihilating race, especially white people, should stop asking what it's like to be black and ask instead what it's like to be white. Okay, then the list of all your privileges is going to come to you. What is it like to be Savarna in this country? You can say things and you can get away with it. Okay, you can write trash in the name of research and be given medals for it. Okay, you can keep producing column after column of bullshit the way Manu Joseph is doing, and only have trolls and not have serious accusations of intellectuality being raised against you. Okay, so ask yourself what it's like to be Savarna before you ask yourself what it's like to be Dalit. Okay, and I think that's a step closer to an anti-caste discourse.
If I could just add on to that, Dipanta, could you repeat the question just once for me, please?
Yeah, so there's two parts of this question. If caste is something that was created and propagated by people, is it still necessary to attribute ourselves to something that was created like this? And second, by simply looking into our identity, are we not adding to the ladder in the name of annihilation?
Okay. So I'll just answer the second part because Vijata ma'am just answered the first one and the second. So I just want to add on to the second part. It's by talking about your identity, you're not adding on to the ladder. I feel like you're breaking every step of that ladder by addressing specific issues, right? I feel like instead of adding on to this ladder that you say, I feel like it's more of you when you talk about caste, when you have conversations about it, right? You're addressing it. You're not ignoring it, like Vijata ma'am said. And when you do those things, you're not adding on to the ladder, rather, you're breaking every step that that ladder has. So, in that way, I honestly feel like it's more of a breaking the steps that the system has given for us rather than adding on to it by saying that maybe, yeah, this is, if you talk about caste, you're adding on to your identity. No, I mean, you're breaking this idea of caste and you're breaking that idea of caste with your identity by talking about it, right? This process of writing about caste is what it was for me, was writing it out of my system, right? These experiences are caste experiences, or these are me exploring my identity through caste, right? Now, when I get this out of my system, right, it's doing what you can say, like, it's doing multiple things, right? One, it's me addressing it to myself that these experiences are what I've had. Two, it's me putting it down on paper that this is something that has happened to me. Three, there are people who have access to this, that they are reading this, right? So that is probably going to generate a conversation between either me as the writer and another person who's reading it, or between multiple readers. So that way, when you look at this idea of this identity, by talking about caste, you're adding to the identity. I feel like you're sort of breaking that identity of you with caste. You are writing it out of your system. You are looking beyond it, because that's not the only thing that defines you, right? You're looking at different things, like how Vijata ma'am said, like, you're looking at how you want to make free decisions. You want to know what it is to love. You want to know what it is to just write for, like, write short stories about love, about science, about different things. And if you think that caste might be a limiting factor, it needn't necessarily be. It could be that factor, but honestly, I feel like by talking about these things, you're more breaking that ladder rather than adding on to it. So
I absolutely agree. If I could add something from my own experience about writing about the caste. So because I was so blind, I didn't know. When I started talking to my family and asking them in different ways, like how many people in this family have married someone who is not Mukherjee, Chatterjee, Banerjee, the three Brahmin. Only two people have done this, and both of them had love marriages, and they had ran away and they married. So it was a way for me to also know that my family has been actively participating in caste, and it is not adding to the conversation isn't adding to reinforcing caste. It's a way for me to understand, that how can I stop this. So yeah, so that was my little anecdote. Um, Shiona is asking that Shiona Shaji is asking that through this process of writing about caste, She's scared of over analyzing all the incidents in my past and reading it as something it may not be. Uh, did you, Anquina, face this yourself? If so, how did you deal with it?
I did. I did feel like a lot of the things that I was doing was maybe overreading into a situation. And so when it came to sort of identifying this line that you draw between what is overreading, over analyzing a situation, and what could be like an experience of caste, I feel like um, it's more about you uh, looking at these situations in a way such that you're that third person, right? I go back to that third person because that third person in your situation will help you look at it this way, where honestly so for me, I felt like some of these things, I felt like it wasn't cast, that it may have just been something that I said just like that, right? But what you need to realize is, like I said, you go back to sort of proving why this isn't casteist, or sort of go back to proving why it is caste, right? You look at a particular experience and you judge for yourself, right? You look at it and you say that when someone said something like this, you do give them the benefit of the doubt, right? I like when I was looking at that beef incident, or sorry, that mutton curry incident, I did give that a benefit of the doubt, saying that, you know, this person might have said this because of the lack of the word, for a lack of a better word, right? But at the same time, you cannot let go of the fact that this child would have grown up in a setting where it was constantly repeated around them, right? That was that one word that they would associate it, because the people around them associated with that one word, right? And it's about so this one interesting thing that I sort of discovered while writing these pieces is that um, children sort of mimic the things that adults do. So, like, you know how you put on your mom's sari, you lather her lipstick on yourself, and you look at her and you look at yourself in the mirror and think of your mom, right? Children imitate a lot of what happens at home, right? So when they are put into that situation in school, they do tend to act in ways that, you know, that they're used to hearing at home, right? They tend to say the same things that they would have heard, right? Which is why some people would be repulsed if a dark skinned person who had oily hair and carried a tone bag would come sit next to you, right? these are things that these are things that do happen. And it's not about over analyzing a situation as much as it's acknowledging that there are these different trajectories that the situation can follow, right? So if you can explore the multiple trajectories that this situation follows, you can identify that this could be casteist, or this could be an experience or something that you explore in terms of caste, or this couldn't be, right? You can never necessarily say that everything is caste, but I am going to say this, that unless you can prove that it isn't, then there is a possibility that it could be. So that's how I'd probably answer that.
This is Siona Shaji's question.
Ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
She's worried about overreading, but this is only for Siona Shaji and to others like Siona Shaji. I think they should read first. I don't think they read. They don't read enough. So overreading as a worry can maybe something that we can be worried about after we read enough. I don't think enough people are reading to begin with. Are we overreading the situations? No. I think that again comes from a fear of being confronted with the knowledge that you're not ready to confront. It's a way of hiding behind a kind of safe space and not wanting to stare in the eye something that you don't have answers to, which is a good fear to have. But that's how we begin by unlearning. So no, I don't think there is any such thing called overreading. Siona Shaji, read.
Okay, so we have time for one last question.
Yeah, I think that Desmona's question is a perfect way to
Yeah.
probably end it.
So yeah, Desmona de Mello asks, how much emotion can this paper handle without it becoming a personal essay of sorts?
Interesting.
Who wants to start?
Anquina, why don't you go first?
Um, See, the point of putting the I in there is it'll eventually lead you to like have your emotions in that piece. Honestly, I've asked this question in the conference also when Nitya Vasudevan came. Like, there's this thing of thinking and feeling, and how much of your thought and how much of your emotion do you actually put into something that is autoethnographic in nature. And honestly, you just go with what feels right. Like, you can't do it in any other way. That you start somewhere. Like, I started with food. I didn't know that I was going to end up discovering that I am Dalit, that these experiences that I've had are similar experiences to other people, that these experiences have answered so many questions in my head, and I've put multiple questions in my head as well at the same time, right? That I you need to sort of go with the flow, I suppose, because it's I don't necessarily think that there's one that is going to overpower the other. I feel like there's this thing of it's like striking a balance between the two, and you sort of find your own rhythm as soon as you start writing it out, right? And the one thing that I'd want to say is that a lot of people who are writing this paper would have this thing about identifying the name of their caste and identifying what is the name of their caste. I don't know the name of my caste, I need to know, right, to write this paper. It doesn't necessarily have to come from that. It comes from you exploring different aspects of yourself with this idea of caste, and you identifying with people who have similar experiences, or identifying with these experiences that you've had that you've never seen other people have, right? Experiences that are your own, and experiences that you share with other people, right? That there are similarities. So that's the way in which you sort of go about in looking at the way that you would think about writing this piece. But at some point, you do let your emotions get the better of you, right? That does tend to happen. We're all human in that way. But when you write and when you're putting things out there, you do feel like there are parts of yourself that you would choose to put out there, and that there are parts that you choose to sort of retract and sort of keep in the back seat for a little while, right? So when it comes to thought and emotion and letting that get in the way, I don't necessarily think that would be too much of a problem, as much as you just start writing and see where it goes, and then you sort of see which works better for you. Because unless you try both of those things, you won't necessarily know which one works for you and which one doesn't. So you can't necessarily say, I am going to only think in this paper and only put my thoughts on this paper, or I am only going to put everything that I feel onto this paper. No, you need to sort of figure out the rhythm of balancing both, is what I feel.
So, see, it's an autoethnography research method, and the word auto means self. It's a process of self reflection, and that is the basis of your research. So, I don't know why we should be so afraid of the personal essay as a form. I think it can be quite liberating. And if and I think when you're doing autoethnography, the basis for the research that you're going to conduct is your self reflection, is your curiosity, is your relationship with what you're exploring. And this is a very important module because here you don't have any manual. Only you know you. There aren't 100 research papers and textbooks about you already. And you're on your own. Okay, apart from a few family members that you can interview. And I think this is something that scares people a little bit. the idea of doing something independently for the first time, where you have no one but yourself to confront. Curiosity is a very scary thing. Okay, so I don't see why we should be afraid of it becoming a personal essay. Why can't it be? And with Anquina, when she was writing it, I saw that she rewrote it many, 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 many times. Okay, and one way of doing any kind of research is by going at it again and again and again in as many ways as possible. And that's something that we make students do constantly. We are not just going to accept 100-word essay on what you think about something. No, you're going to revisit it multiple times and see how else it can be explored. Autoethnography shouldn't be confused with a personal essay. It's a way of understanding a community through your experiences. And I think Arul sir introduced me to this autoethnographer called Clifford Geertz, whose paper we are doing in third year class now. And I just love this guy. He is, so he takes his personal curiosity and he's able to view an entire community without bias. And if there is any bias, he's using that to explore himself, not someone else. And I think that can be a great idea of doing research, where you arrive at, I think Clifford Geertz is the answer for every Savarna male intellectual who is too much of himself. Everyone should read him, because he's sort of turning the mirror elsewhere, and he's showing what beautiful possibilities can come out of research. It doesn't have to be one notebook, one pen, you go observe and say subject is eating, subject is shitting, subject is not talking to me. That is not research anymore. Intimacy as a way of research, intimacy, conversation, dialogue, eating with someone, all of this is equally important to research. And again, this can show you why Savarna, in the world of Savarna academia, autoethnography as a form is still not out there, or it's still something that is very easily available within the Dalit autobiography and not elsewhere. Okay, why? Because Dalit people eat food with other people. Okay, they are more prone to experiencing things from elsewhere, and it's not a one-sided experience. Okay, they are naturally researchers in any sense of the word. Okay, they are social science scientists in any sense of the word, because they are more willing and they're more open to all kinds of experiences. Okay, there's no nastiness compared to I can't eat with this person, I can't eat with that person, I can't be friends with this person, I can't read you, this is too unqualified for me, I'm not going to deal with this. No. Okay, so as a form itself, that's what's most relaxing about it, because it's about your intimacies, and you take it and you explore other people with it and yourself.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Anquina. So yeah, so we're done with the Q&A round, and yeah, so I think this discussion has allowed us, and also hopefully a lot of the audience members, to think about research, to rethink about what we think passes off as knowledge, to look at our own history, memory, lived experiences more seriously, and that process is also research. Thank you so much for joining and talking today. Thank you to the audience members for asking us questions and for their responses and observations as well. With this, we bring the first webinar to a close. Also, thank you to the Department of English for hosting this and making this happen. Thank you.
Thank you.
One small announcement. Yeah, I'll just make one quick announcement. So this is the first in the series of our webinars that we'll be conducting, organized by the Department of English. So please watch out for this space. We have a bunch of events lined up. So posts about this will go up on social media. We have already scheduled a bunch of webinars with writers who agreed to come and talk to us. So please let us know if give us ideas on what you'd like to see and things like that. But if Anquina would have any closing remarks, I'd like her to say a few things.
Okay. Honestly, I just like to thank the department for giving me this opportunity to talk. This experience has been like eye opening to say the least, and it's been a process that took a lot out of me. And honestly, without the support of people from the department like Arul sir, Vijayata ma'am, Achita ma'am, Vijay Shanti ma'am, all of them, every single person in that department has sort of told me that, you know, at every single point that I got stuck when I was writing this piece, they were like, just go with it, just write whatever you want. And honestly, this kind of support that you need when you fall back and you realize that there are people out there to support you is what keeps students like me going. Like what keeps telling students like me that it's okay to feel the things that you are feeling, and it's okay that you're feeling it, but we will support you and we'll help you through this process. And honestly, I just like to thank the department for making us feel like we could be a part of that, right? And that like how Arosa said at Meta, that love is what we offer at the department and nothing else. And that's what goes with the way our department functions. And I'd just like to say thank you.
Thank you so much, Dipanita. This is great. Thank you so much, Anquina. Looking forward to nothing else. Yeah, sorry, you had something to say.
No, I'm just saying that this video will hopefully most likely be re-uploaded on the department channel, English department channel, right? And people who have missed this can watch it there. I will post the link to that when it's uploaded somewhere.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay,
Nice
thank you.
weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Have fun.
Can you guys stay online? I mean, after we go off
Yeah, yeah.
YouTube.
Okay.
Linto, are we still on?
Yeah,
Are we
we're
still
still
live?
online.
Don't make us live for a while. Okay. Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay. Are we still live?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, guys. I'm going to say hi to everyone who's in the audience so that they don't feel all, oh, there is nobody looking at us.
Oh, this is